Hi guys, how old are you? I'd love to see the age range of our viewers. Write your age below.
They say death brings out the best in people. But whoever said that never stood at a mahogany casket watching their mother smile like a cat that just swallowed the canary. My father, Graham Carter, was barely cold in the ground, and my mother, Eleanor, was already back in her element, walking through the funeral reception like it was a black tie gala thrown in her honor. She looked flawless, of course, like always, tailored black dress, pearls that belonged to her grandmother, and a posture so rigid you'd think shame was a physical affliction she'd never contracted. She had that way about her, like she'd been born with a glass of champagne in one hand and a dagger in the other. I used to think I imagined the cruelty behind her perfect smile, that maybe I was too sensitive, too emotional, too me. But that day confirmed what I had suspected my whole life. My mother loved power more than she ever loved any of us. It was just after the service, and guests were milling around the house. We'd opened the doors to the family estate, Carter Hill, for the gathering, as expected of us, and the air was thick with condolences and veiled curiosity. People weren't just mourning, they were watching to see who would inherit, who would lead, who would crumble. I had spent the morning going through the motions, holding my brother James's arm as if we were some kind of united front, when in reality we hadn't had a real conversation in months. James, as the golden boy, had always done what our mother told him to do. From prom dates to college majors, he was her puppet in khakis and a Lacoste polo, and maybe he liked it that way. I was standing near the fireplace when Eleanor clinked her glass with the side of a silver spoon, so genteel, so elegant, and the room quieted. Her voice rang out with that distinctive tone that made everyone shut up without ever raising the volume. "Thank you all for coming," she said, lips curled into something resembling warmth. "Graham would have been touched to see you all here." A few polite nods, some murmurs, a cough. She waited until the attention was fully, irrevocably hers. "I know some of you have questions about the estate," she continued, with the flair of someone unveiling a painting. "So let me make this simple. The will has been executed. The company, Carter Engineering, will continue under the Carter family name. James, of course, will assume the formal responsibilities. And—" She paused then, a sparkle of something vicious flickering in her eyes. "Vanessa will not be receiving any part of the inheritance." The silence that followed was dense enough to choke on. I felt every eye pivot toward me like heat-seeking missiles. Some people blinked awkwardly, others looked at their shoes. Aunt Rita let out a soft gasp and quickly turned it into a cough. I didn't move. I just looked at her, my mother, and waited for the punchline. And it came. Eleanor smiled wider. That same tight, victorious grin she wore when she beat someone at bridge, or found out the neighbor's son had dropped out of Yale. "Now," she said, a light laugh dancing behind her words, "you'll finally learn your place." I think most daughters would have cried, maybe run out of the room, maybe screamed or knocked over a vase. But I just smirked. Not the sarcastic kind, not a nervous tick. No, it was slow, controlled, and sharper than any knife in the kitchen. I let it sit there, that smirk hanging on my face like a threat she didn't see coming. "Funny," I said, slowly taking a sip of my water, "because I acquired controlling shares in Dad's company last month. You ever watch someone's soul leave their body? I have." Her smile flickered just once, but it was enough. Enough to feel the shift in the room. People didn't move, but their energy turned. They weren't just watching anymore, they were calculating. Eleanor didn't say a word. She couldn't, because in that moment she realized she no longer held all the cards. Now, before you think this was a random act of rebellion or some soap opera stunt, let me tell you something. This wasn't sudden. This was a slow burn, a calculated plan, hatched not out of anger, but out of years of quiet humiliation, subtle gaslighting, and being treated like I was disposable in my own family. You see, I didn't grow up in a house where love was given freely. I grew up in a house where everything had a price, and love came with receipts. Eleanor had been setting the stage for this kind of public humiliation my whole life. She just didn't think I'd ever grow up to understand the game, let alone beat her at it. And if you're wondering how I managed to acquire those shares, if I forged something or stole it or tricked someone, you've never dealt with someone like me. I didn't need to cheat. I just needed to listen, to wait, to notice how my father never fully trusted Eleanor with certain decisions, how he kept old friends around for quiet conversations, how he insisted that I study law, not because I'd be a good lawyer, but because I'd need to protect myself. My father wasn't a saint, but he wasn't blind either. That day at the funeral reception was just the opening move. Eleanor thought she could bury me along with my father's casket. What she didn't know was that I'd already started rewriting the legacy she thought she controlled. I wasn't just his daughter. I was his contingency plan. Now let me ask you something and be honest. If your own mother laughed while cutting you out of your father's legacy, told you to learn your place in front of every person who'd ever mattered to your family, what would you do? Would you walk away and let it go? Or would you smile back like I did, knowing damn well the empire she just tried to weaponize was already yours? Stick around. The games haven't even started yet. It's strange how memory works, not as a sequence of clean chronological events, but as a disjointed chain of images and sounds that come flooding back when you least expect them. That evening, after the funeral debacle and my mother's public attempt at humiliation, I sat alone in the library of the house I grew up in, surrounded by the leather-bound books my father had collected over 4 decades, breathing in that heavy, comforting smell of old pages, varnished wood, and quiet judgment. And as the fire cracked in the hearth like it had 1,000 times before, I found myself back in a time I had almost buried. When I was a little girl, watching my mother control every conversation, every holiday, every breath of life in our household, while I learned to swallow my questions and catalog my pain in silence. I was 8 when I first realized my mother didn't want me to be strong. Not truly, she wanted me obedient, polished, and decorative, like the floral arrangements she had flown in from Connecticut every Thanksgiving. She told me that emotions were like wine, fine in moderation, embarrassing when spilled. I had spilled a lot. I cried when I scraped my knee on the tennis court. I cried when our golden retriever, Oliver, died. I cried the day she threw away my painting because it didn't match the living room's color scheme. Each time she reacted the same way, pursed lips, a sigh like I was a burden, and those quiet words she wielded like a scalpel. You'll never survive the world if you let it see you bleed. James, on the other hand, could do no wrong. When he failed algebra in the 9th grade, she hired a tutor and blamed the school. When he got caught drinking behind the garage with his lacrosse buddies, she smoothed it over with the police chief and blamed peer pressure. He was her prince, her legacy, her second chance to mold a man who would carry the Carter name like a flag. Meanwhile, I was sent to etiquette classes and told to keep my voice down at the dinner table because assertiveness is not the same as being loud, Vanessa. I learned early on that being smart made people uncomfortable, especially when you were a girl, especially when you were their daughter, and especially when they knew you might be smarter than them one day. My father, God, he tried. He wasn't a weak man, but he was tired. By the time I hit high school, he had long surrendered the battle for household dominance to Eleanor, choosing instead to retreat into his company, his bourbon, and the quiet satisfaction of watching me from afar. He never said much, not when it counted, not when I wanted him to stand up to her, but every now and then, in the privacy of his study, he'd invite me in under the pretense of helping with paperwork or reviewing financial statements. He'd walk me through ledgers and balance sheets like bedtime stories, showing me how companies breathed and bled like people. He taught me about liabilities, about risk, about the long game. Assets, he used to say, are never just things. They're leverage, Vanessa. Remember that. It was on one of those quiet, half-lit afternoons that I saw it. Fear, real, undisguised fear in my father's eyes when Eleanor barged into the study and saw us hunched over spreadsheets. She didn't yell, she didn't scold. She smiled that smile, the same one she used at the funeral, and said, "Sweetheart, you're confusing her. Numbers are for the boardroom, not the ballroom." My father didn't argue. He just nodded, gently closed the folder, and said nothing more about it. But I didn't forget. And that's why, years later, when I found the small oak box tucked behind the false panel in my father's study, a box that hadn't been there when he was alive, one he must have had someone install toward the end, I knew it wasn't just some sentimental time capsule. Inside, folded neatly like a letter to a future he wasn't sure would come, was a handwritten note in his distinct, tidy script. "Look beneath what they gave you," it read, "and you'll find what they feared you'd discover." It took me 3 full days to understand what he meant. I didn't sleep much during that time, pacing the halls of Carter Hill like a ghost, running my fingers along the old wood railings, listening to the echo of my own thoughts, and thinking about every moment where my mother had redirected, rephrased, or outright denied me access to information. I started pulling files from the archive room, tracing shareholder transactions, going back decades through stock movements and acquisition contracts. It was slow, grueling work, but eventually a pattern emerged. My father had quietly, consistently been shifting small blocks of equity out of Eleanor's control. Some of them were hidden behind trusts, some placed under shell entities, some gifted to a non-executive party whose identity was protected under legal sealing. That party, as it turned out, was me. Buried under layers of legal red tape and obscure company registrations, there existed a clause in one of the original Carter Engineering documents that allowed shares held under a family-based trust to be transferred upon death, not according to the will, but according to operational interest, should the trustee be involved in strategic development. I had written 3 internal memos while working unofficially on a product design at the company in my 20s. My father had archived those documents under my name, filed them, and used them to qualify me as a silent stakeholder. He had given me the key, quietly, carefully, lovingly, in the only way he knew how. That moment broke me, not in grief, but in realization. My father had seen me. All those years when I thought he was looking past me, he had actually been looking ahead. I wasn't just an emotional daughter to him. I was the one he believed in, even if he couldn't say it out loud. Eleanor might have orchestrated the will, manipulated the legal stage, and performed her little theater of control, but she hadn't seen what he'd left behind, hidden like a seed waiting to bloom at the right time. And now, the garden was mine. What she didn't understand, what she never would, is that daughters like me don't need thrones handed to them. We build our own out of the bricks they threw at us. The next move would be mine, and it wouldn't be loud, it wouldn't be dramatic. It would be precise, surgical, and undeniable. Because little girls don't inherit empires, they take them. By the time the frost crept over the hedges of Carter Hill and the morning air had started to smell like burning firewood and winter, I had already put the first pieces in motion, and the silence of it all was the most exquisite part, like watching a chess game where the other player didn't even realize the match had started. I hadn't grown up in boardrooms, not in the way my brother had, escorted to shareholder meetings like a tiny prince in training, shaking hands with gray-haired men in suits who laughed too loudly and called him the future of Carter Engineering. While I was sent to smile politely with the wives and daughters, nibble on canapes, and pretend not to understand the conversations just over my shoulder, but I had listened, and I had remembered. Every term, every sidelong glance, every shareholder's name spoken in hushed tones when Mother thought I wasn't paying attention. And now those memories were currency, and I was ready to spend every last one of them. It began with a phone call to a man named Tom Daniels, my father's longtime attorney, and possibly the only person still alive, who had the full breadth of Graham Carter's trust, without also fearing Eleanor's wrath. Tom had always been a quiet presence at family events, polished, patient, a man who seemed to observe more than he spoke. But I remembered the way my father once put a hand on his shoulder and said, "This man knows where all the bones are buried," with the kind of gravity that stuck with me long after I understood what it meant. So I called him, not expecting much, honestly not knowing if he'd even take my side. But the moment I introduced myself and mentioned the clause in the original operating agreement, the one about strategic development and non-executive stakeholders. There was a pause so long and heavy on the line, I thought maybe the connection had dropped. But then Tom sighed, slow and deliberate, and said, "Your father always said you'd be the one who asked the right question." Over the next several weeks, we worked like ghosts. I didn't confront Eleanor, didn't challenge James, didn't storm the gates or demand answers. I met Tom in discreet cafes across the city, exchanged folders and emails through encrypted channels, and slowly began to piece together the fragmented shares that had been quietly drifting over the years. Some held by silent partners, some bought by shell companies my father had set up decades earlier, and a few still clutched by old colleagues whose loyalty to Graham Carter hadn't died with him. It wasn't fast, and it wasn't easy. Each conversation required care, finesse, a delicate blend of nostalgia and business acumen that I had to summon from deep within. Because I wasn't just asking for money. I was asking these people to believe that I could lead something my family never thought I deserved to touch. And they did. Partly because of my father's name, yes, but also because I came prepared. I didn't pitch dreams, I pitched strategy. I laid out a vision for Carter Engineering that wasn't about legacy or family pride, but about innovation, sustainability, growth. The kind of language that cuts through boardroom politics and speaks directly to the bottom line. They listened. Some pushed back. One man, an old VP named Kessler, laughed in my face and told me, "You're good, but your mother will eat you alive." I looked him dead in the eye and said, "That's why I'm bringing poison." He stopped laughing after that. It took less than 3 months to secure the majority stake, 51%, quietly acquired, strategically distributed, and all legally above board. And the beauty of it all? Eleanor didn't see a single step of it. She was too busy planning foundation galas, micromanaging James's speaking engagements, and crafting press releases about Carter Engineering's family leadership, to notice the ground shifting beneath her feet. James, predictably, spent most of his time doing whatever she told him, completely unaware that the throne he thought was his had already been stripped of its power. The final piece was a document, a standard shareholder notification requesting acknowledgement of a leadership vote to be held at the next board meeting. Routine, dry, buried under dozens of similar-looking forms. I had Tom slide it into a packet for Eleanor to sign. Nothing sneaky, nothing hidden. It was all there, in black and white. But she didn't read it. Of course she didn't. She never read the fine print. Never imagined that the daughter she dismissed as too soft, too sensitive, too emotional could navigate a corporate takeover without raising her voice. She signed it with a flourish, probably thinking it was a memo about marketing expenses or sponsorship renewals. I took that document, framed it, and hung it on the wall of my downtown office the next day. You see, power isn't always taken by force. Sometimes it's taken with patience, with knowledge, and with an unnerving ability to smile while someone sharpens the knife they don't know is for them. I didn't want to burn down the house my father built. I just wanted to take back the keys. What they never understood is that I was never interested in the inheritance. I was interested in the influence. The ability to walk into a room and know that I wasn't there because someone let me in. I was there because I owned the door. And now that door was wide open. The next board meeting was already scheduled. Eleanor would be sitting at the head of the table, James at her side, confident in the illusion of power they had carefully crafted together over the years. But when the votes were counted, when the signatures were verified, and when I finally stood at the other end of the table holding the controlling shares in my hand, what then? Would they finally see me? Or would they realize too late that the girl they tried to sideline had never been playing the same game as them in the first place? That answer was coming, and I couldn't wait to watch their faces when it did. There's a moment, right before a storm breaks, where everything stands unnaturally still, where even the air seems to hold its breath, thick with anticipation and threat, as if the universe itself is giving one final chance to run before the sky cracks open. That's how it felt walking into the boardroom that morning, the one on the 32nd floor of the Carter Engineering headquarters, a space designed more for intimidation than collaboration, all cold marble and steel with windows stretching from floor to ceiling. exposing the skyline like a battlefield waiting to be claimed. The room was full, as expected, with every board member seated, polished, and alert, each of them dressed in various shades of power: navy, charcoal, the occasional deep green, and not one of them looked surprised to see me walk in, though I caught a few shifting in their chairs, unsure if what was about to happen was theater, conflict, or coup. Eleanor, of course, was already seated at the head of the table, her hands folded neatly in front of her, a serene expression carved across her face like a woman sitting in a pew rather than at the precipice of a business reckoning. She wore a tailored ivory suit, not black, not gray, but ivory. Like she wanted the room to know she still considered herself untouchable. The untarnished matriarch of this empire she had never actually built, but had always claimed as her own. James sat beside her, his posture tense, but trying desperately to mimic the calm he thought was expected of him, though I could see the flicker of confusion in his eyes, a subtle but telling sign that somewhere beneath his composed exterior, the reality was beginning to seep in, and the golden boy mask was beginning to crack. I didn't take the open seat offered to me midway down the table. Instead, I walked, slowly, deliberately, to the opposite end, placing my folder gently on the polished surface, and met Eleanor's gaze with the kind of calm she had spent a lifetime trying to teach me, but had never managed to possess herself. And in that silence, in that thick electric pause before I spoke, I saw it, the tiniest flicker in her expression, a microsecond of hesitation, like the queen sensing the poison in the chalice, just after she's taken the first sip. "Before we begin," I said, my voice steady, full, controlled, echoing slightly against the stone walls, "there's a matter of leadership to address." I opened the folder, pulled out the documents Tom and I had meticulously prepared, and handed them to the board secretary, who glanced at them, then looked to Eleanor, then looked back at me with the dawning realization that whatever he was about to witness was not what had been rehearsed. "This is a formal motion," I continued, not looking at my mother but directly at the other members, "to recognize a change in controlling interest. As of this morning, I hold 51% of voting shares in Carter Engineering through a combination of direct ownership and vested trust allocations." I paused, letting the weight of it sink in. "Therefore, under Article 4, Section 2 of the Operating Charter, I am assuming executive authority effective immediately." The room did not erupt. It didn't have to. The tension was loud enough. I saw some eyes darting between faces, a few mouths opening as if to speak, then closing again, unsure which way the wind was blowing. Eleanor didn't move, she didn't flinch, but she also didn't speak, because she knew, somewhere deep in her highly trained, instinctively manipulative core, she knew this wasn't bluster. This wasn't a tantrum or a challenge or a plea for recognition. This was the end of her reign, and it was arriving with the quiet, precise efficiency she had once admired in others, and never imagined she'd see turned against her. James, for his part, looked like someone had poured cold water down his back. "This has to be a mistake," he muttered, voice low, desperate, as if hoping someone else would object for him. Someone would step in and make it untrue by sheer will. "Mom, can she do this?" "She already has," said the board chair, an older man named Lawrence who had been with the company longer than I'd been alive, and who had likely seen more family drama than a primetime soap. He looked down at the documents again, adjusted his glasses, and said, "The paperwork's in order. The shares are consolidated. This is binding." Still, Eleanor said nothing. She sat there, hands still folded, the corner of her mouth twitching slightly like she wanted to say something devastating and cutting and final, but couldn't quite find the words that wouldn't betray how completely she'd been outplayed. And then, with the air in the room practically vibrating from tension, I looked at her, not at the board, not at James, just her. "You spent your whole life teaching me to stay in line," I said, my voice just loud enough to carry. "To be quiet, be agreeable, be invisible unless you needed me for optics. But while you were grooming James to inherit your idea of control, I was learning something else entirely. how to wait, how to listen, and how to strike when no one saw it coming. That was when Aunt Rita stood. Aunt Rita, my father's older sister, who had spent years orbiting the family like a satellite no one paid attention to, unless she had something pleasant to say, walked to the center of the room, placed a single folder in front of the board, and said, "It's time they knew what else Eleanor has been hiding." The folder contained evidence of misappropriated company funds, personal trips billed as business expenses, unapproved contracts pushed through under false pretenses, and a quiet little shell company in the Cayman Islands set up in James's name, likely without his full understanding. I didn't plan it, didn't even ask Rita for it, but the timing couldn't have been more perfect. She must have seen the writing on the wall long before I did. And Eleanor? She finally broke her silence. "You think you've won," she said, slowly rising to her feet, voice lower than I'd ever heard it, no longer regal but raw. "You think this little stunt makes you powerful, but all you've done is destroy what your father built." "No," I replied, steady as stone. "What you built was a version of the company that served your ego. What Dad built was a legacy. I'm just protecting it from you." The vote was formal, and it was fast. I was instated as acting CEO by majority approval. The motion passed without objection. James didn't even look at me as he left the room. Eleanor sat for a while, still at the head of the table, as if clinging to the illusion of authority, even after it had been ripped from her hands. Eventually, she stood, gathered her things, and walked out without saying another word. As I looked out across the city from the glass wall of the boardroom, I realized something. Winning didn't feel like I thought it would. It didn't come with applause or triumph or even relief. It came with silence, with clarity, with the heavy, quiet understanding that power isn't about holding the throne. It's about deciding whether or not the crown is even worth wearing. And I had just inherited a kingdom made of ash. The days that followed my ascent to power were not filled with the satisfaction or vindication I had imagined during those long, silent nights of planning and quiet maneuvering, but rather with the kind of surreal numbness that settles in after a natural disaster. When the storm has passed, the winds have died down, and yet everything familiar looks just a little bit off, slightly twisted out of place, as if the universe itself has shifted in its orbit and left you to figure out how to walk again on uneven ground. Carter Engineering was now, officially and unquestionably, under my control, yet the victory tasted less like triumph and more like inevitability, as if I had finally taken my rightful place, not on a pedestal, but on a high wire stretched thin across a chasm I never asked to cross. My first official act as CEO was not some grand pronouncement or sweeping policy change, but rather a quiet restructuring of internal authority, where I reassigned responsibilities, consolidated departments, and removed several of Eleanor's loyalists from key positions, not out of spite, but because trust is not a luxury you can afford when you've spent your life watching daggers being passed off as olive branches. I operated like a surgeon, not a soldier, making incisions where needed, not to punish, but to remove the rot before it could spread. The company needed healing, and I wasn't naive enough to think that just because I had changed the locks, the poison in the air would magically dissipate. Eleanor, unsurprisingly, did not go quietly into the background. She began maneuvering behind the scenes, attempting to rally allies, former donors, family friends, and a few timid board members, into questioning the legality and ethics of my takeover. There were whispers of lawsuits, veiled threats in industry publications, and even a small-scale media campaign that painted her as the betrayed widow of a visionary, cast aside by an ungrateful daughter driven by ambition and unresolved childhood wounds. She was a master at crafting narratives, weaving half-truths into palatable lies designed for public consumption, and I would have been lying if I said it didn't sting to see her manipulate the story so effectively, twisting my careful, calculated moves into something ugly and self-serving. But I didn't respond, not directly, because I understood something she never had. Real power doesn't scream, it doesn't flinch, it waits. And when the timing is right, it speaks in a voice so calm and absolute, There's no room left for debate. That voice came during our final meeting. She requested it formally and through intermediaries, as if suddenly recognizing that the daughter she once dismissed could no longer be summoned with a phone call or an order barked across a dining room table. We met in my father's old office, now reclaimed and restored to its original layout, no longer a mausoleum to his memory, but a space designed for work, strategy, and reflection. She walked in wearing black, always aware of the power of optics, and I allowed myself the indulgence of one long look at her. This woman who had dominated my life with elegance and cruelty in equal measure, who had raised me like a bonsai tree, trimming away everything unruly or inconvenient, until all that remained was a curated version of a daughter she could control. She didn't sit right away, preferring to pace, to observe the room like a battlefield she'd once conquered and now found herself exiled from. "You know," she said finally, her voice low but steady, "this wasn't supposed to happen like this. Your father would have..." "Would have what?" I interrupted, not out of disrespect, but out of exhaustion. "He would have wanted peace. He would have preferred his daughter to keep pretending she didn't see what you were doing." Eleanor didn't answer, but her eyes flickered, just once, betraying the smallest crack in her carefully constructed facade. "I didn't want a war," I continued, gesturing around us. "I wanted acknowledgement. A seat at the table, not because I'm entitled, not because I needed your validation, but because I earned it. Because I worked, I waited, I learned. And you, with every opportunity, chose to ignore that. You made me a threat before I ever lifted a finger." She finally sat, folding her hands in her lap, and asked a question I never expected. "Why didn't you take it all?" I didn't answer right away, because the truth wasn't simple, and saying it out loud felt like drawing blood from a wound I'd only just stopped hiding. "Because I didn't want everything," I said at last, quietly. "I wanted enough to protect the parts of him that mattered. His work, his people, his principles. Taking everything would have made me you." For the first time, something in her shifted, not softened, not broken, but shifted, like she was seeing me not as a rival or a rebellious daughter, but as something she had never been willing to admit. Her equal, or worse, her better. She left without another word. And that was how it ended. Not with shouting, not with reconciliation, not with a hug or a tearful apology, but with silence. A door closing softly, a legacy shifting hands, and the eerie, echoing realization that sometimes the most powerful moment in a conflict is the one where nobody speaks. The weeks that followed brought change, some of it welcome, some of it painful. James disappeared into obscurity, swallowed by his own indecision and the realization that he had been used more than trusted. Aunt Rita became an unlikely advisor, her calm wisdom a steadying force in the sea of transition. The company stabilized, and slowly Carter Engineering began to evolve, not into a monument to me or to my father, but into something sustainable, forward-thinking, and for the first time, honest. And yet, despite everything, despite the victory, the control, the carefully executed revenge, I still wonder sometimes whether I became the villain in someone else's story, whether the cost of reclaiming my place came with collateral damage I'll never fully comprehend. Maybe I did become cold. Maybe I did lose something in the fire I started. Or maybe, just maybe, I finally understood what it meant to be powerful without being cruel, to protect what matters without destroying what's left. I'll leave that to others to decide, because in the end, the truth is never simple, and legacy, like love, is rarely clean.